it is with great gratitude, actually, Diane, Brady, and Albert Wenger. Albert was one of the first people we talked to about this thing, because we knew he's been working on this topic. And thank you both. Diane, I'll let you do the whole introduction.
I'm the soft skills gender diversity that from the previous panel. So hi, everybody. I want to start with, but I'm not the talent. This is the talent right here. So I want to start with just a very quick show of hands as to when you look out, let's say 10 years, who is pessimistic about the future of work? Raise your hands about the disruption, about the pain that we'll go through, and who is optimistic? So I think the most tech conferences I go to is perennially staffed with optimists. And I'm intrigued, so Albert, I'm sure you know Albert. I certainly know you as partner of Union Square Ventures, entrepreneur, pundit, PhD, now author of World After Capital, and we're talking about what is work and can we live without it? So first define work for us as you define it. I've got my own, but I'm curious to hear yours.
Hi, everyone.
I can do the.
How is this? Oh my God,
Good.
much
We'll
louder.
start singing.
All right. Okay, so I'm gonna whisper up here. The seats up here are no more expensive than the ones back there, by the way.
Yes, this is an intimate fireside chat.
Come on up. So I think one of the interesting things about digital technologies is that they tend to unbundle things. And as it turns out, work is a bundle of many different things. So, you know, when we think of work, we think of where people spend their day, structure in their day. When we think of work, we think of social connections. You spend a lot of hours at work. When we think of work, we think of income, what you use to pay for things. When we think of work, we think of purpose in life. So work is a complicated thing because it combines so many different things. And if you think about what digital technologies have done in other areas, they've unbundled them, right? So, you know, if you take newspapers as an example, newspapers had sports and opinion and stock quotes and classified advertising, and all of those things have migrated to different places. And that's happened in many, many areas over and over. And so I believe it's one of the things that's happening with work as well. We're unbundling work, and we're not really understanding that that's what we're doing. And so we're just trying to fix work by keeping it together at a time when it's being forced apart.
Now, when you say unbundling work, let's just talk about jobs, because I see work as where I make money to feed families, buy clothes, buy iPhones, et cetera. When you think about it, we've got this sort of dystopian view where you've got all these robots that are going to take over functions. You've got the gig economy where we heard a lot about the sort of angst that people have sometimes going into that. Give me some sense as to where we get our purpose. And I want to get to the concept of the universal basic income. So let's go with that first, because I think that's interesting of why do we need in this environment or soon some sort of basic income for people?
So let me first explain what the idea behind basic income is for people who don't know about it. It's the idea that you would receive some amount of money from government every month, maybe $800, maybe $1,000 for adults, something in that range.
And everybody gets it.
Everybody gets it. That's what makes it universal. And basic, what makes it basic is the idea that it's enough to cover your basic needs. So clothing, food, shelter, access to the internet.
$800 a month, raise your hands. Yeah, no. But
so people say $800, how does that possibly work? But obviously it doesn't work if you want to live in Manhattan. But right now, for instance, if you wanted to live in Detroit, the city of Detroit is giving away houses. In fact, their only alternative to giving them away is to raise them. So the reason I believe this is something that we need to think very seriously about is because I believe we're at the end of the industrial society. So if you want to take a really, really high level view of human history, we've gone through a couple of fundamental changes of how we do things. We started out as foragers, and then we invented agriculture, which was kind of a series of interlocking inventions, you know, seeding, irrigation, domestication of animals, etc. And then we wound up with the agrarian age. And then we had the Enlightenment, and we had science, and we had steam power and electric power and chemistry, and that heaved us into the industrial age. And now we have these new machines, which are digital machines. And digital machines are different from all the sort of physical machines that we built before them, and they're different in two fundamental ways. They can do things at zero marginal cost. So if there's a live stream of this, for instance, or photographs that you've taken, you can share those with anybody anywhere in the world at no additional cost. So that's one thing that's never been true before. And then the other thing that's never been true before is that digital technologies are universal technologies. So anything that can be computed by a digital computer. Now, if you take something like diagnosis of a disease, it's taking symptoms and backing into what the underlying causes could be. That's an act of computation. And a machine will be able to do that eventually, and will be able to do it incredibly well, and will be able to do it at zero marginal cost. So we're going to have another one of these transitions, and it will be as big a transition as going from the agrarian age to the industrial age. And much of the earlier discussion, which is dealing with the here and now, because these are companies that are operating in the here and now, and they have to deal with the regulations as they are today. But if you take a step back, the bigger question is, how do we get past some of these old lines of thinking, which are largely industrial lines of thinking, and how do we get into what comes after that?
And I think that's interesting. And we're going to take a lot of questions. One of the things I think is interesting is when I think of that type of world, I think Wall-E, and I think, sort of the, what is our purpose in that environment? And when you think about sort of the government response, there's a lot of curiosity just about the political climate right now. There's a lot of fear people have, and they're trying to preserve jobs, they're trying to hold on to them. So if I made you president, what would you do to try and incorporate your view of the future?
Yeah, so the Wall-E fear, the fear that people are naturally lazy and will just sort of loaf around and get fat. The sort of evidence of human endeavor doesn't really bear that out. Lots of people do amazing things without getting paid for them, and they do them because they're intrinsically motivated to do them. Now, you can't just expect to change one thing in society. You can't expect to roll out a basic income and have people be know what their purpose is, have people be intrinsically motivated, et cetera. For instance, you have to understand we've created a school system that it's the perfect fit with the industrial society. We have a school system that's an industrial school system.
So you homeschool your children.
We homeschool our children.
And so how, if I'm being homeschooled by you as one of your children, which I'm not, of course, how would my life be different? What are you teaching your kids that you think is different than the public school, private school system as it exists now?
Well, one of the things is to give them a lot more free time. So we've doubled down on all these ideas that everybody needs to learn everything. They all need to learn the same thing. We have standardized tests that everybody needs to pass. We're massively overscheduling kids. And so as a result, they don't have a lot of time to think about what it is that they want to do, what actually motivates them. And your earlier question was about purpose. I think purpose comes from understanding, from having time to think about why you're here. A lot of people don't think about it, and that's why you wind up with midlife crises.
Or retirement being something that will kill you if done as intended.
Yes, exactly. Or you wind up with people who, parents who obsess about getting kids into the right nursery school so you can get into the right high school, so you can get into the right college, so that you can get hired by, I don't know, Goldman Sachs or McKinsey or whatever. I mean, a lot of these things are sort of these paths that are set out for many people, and there's not enough downtime to sort of explore other things and think about why we're all here collectively and what we should be working on individually.
So I want to take some questions from the audience. But before we do that, I want to talk to you as also a venture capitalist, as a professional, and on a personal level. So let's start with the personal. How are you yourself sort of preparing for this environment? I mean, certainly we should be developing more hobbies, perhaps. We should be realizing that, the gig economy, most people have embraced it now and understanding they have to kind of perhaps be more creative about how they build their careers. But give me some sense of knowing what you know. How are you living your life?
Well, I'm in a extremely fortunate position, which is that I get to do something that I love every day, and I get paid for it, and I recognize that that's incredibly fortunate. but I do think fundamentally starting with asking the question, if you're in that kind of position where you're not worried about how you're going to put food on your table, you're not worried about how to pay rent, but then spending more time thinking about, okay, what is it that I want to contribute to? And when I say we're at the end of the industrial society, I believe that the sort of thing that comes after it is a knowledge society. And in my book, I talk about the knowledge loop. And the knowledge loop is about learning something, using that to create something, and sharing that. And that loop sort of becomes a reinforcing loop. And that doesn't just have to be scientific knowledge. That can be art, that can be music, and there are many other contributions that can be made to this knowledge loop. But I think the starting point is to go back to the idea of why we had philosophy, which is to understand questions of purpose.
Professionally, in terms of the investment horizon, we know on terms of big bucket areas whether it's big data, machine learning, artificial intelligence, where the money is going. But there's also this fear of these titans that have, the Googles, the Amazons. And can you give me some sense from the investment landscape of anything that's overhyped, underappreciated as you look at these trends on work?
I wrote a blog post maybe within the last couple of weeks. There are lots of areas that are overhyped, but we need the hype cycle. The hype cycle is what pours a lot of dollars into technology. It advances the technology, and there is sort of a model in which you have this hype cycle at the beginning. We had an earlier speaker talk about the hype cycle in 3D printing, right? It's that hype that allocates a lot of resources, advances the technology very rapidly, and then afterwards you get a phase. This is called the installation phase. And afterwards you get a phase that's so-called deployment phase. This model is from an economist by the name of Carlota Perez, and she studied many previous sort of these technological inflection points. And so you need the hype cycle to then have lots of deployed resources. And we saw that with Web 1.0, where we had a big hype cycle, but it also led to a lot of investment in bandwidth, for instance, that we subsequently put to good use. And so I think we're seeing that in AR, VR, there's a big hype cycle. We're seeing a hype cycle in blockchain. I'm very bullish on all of these things in the long run, but they're all going to go through this kind of hype cycle.
And what about the people who are feeling marginalized, displaced, that their jobs are going away and they don't see a reasonable substitute for what's coming back? How big a pain period is that, and how are we coping with it, or is there some part of the world that's coping with it better than us?
No, I think we're coping with it very poorly, both here in the US and in Europe. And I think the rise of populist leaders all around the world, I think is largely a reflection on there being a large part of the population that senses that this transition out of the industrial age is happening, that it's leaving them behind, and that most mainstream politicians are talking about, oh, we're going to tweak interest rates a little bit, we're going to have better educational programs, and that's going to fix everything. And people are like, it seems to me we've been trying that for the last decade or maybe a couple decades and it hasn't done anything for us. And so then you get leaders who are like, I'm going to make America great again. And that will resonate with some people. And I think there is a problem where mainstream politicians are not willing to say, hey, we may have reached the end of the system and we may need more drastic measures. And so people who are proposing more drastic measures will continue to rise in popularity as long as that happens.
Does anybody have questions? I could continue. Go ahead. Hi.
A lot of different industries, blockchain, finance, Bitcoin, USDC, e-commerce. Do you think that capitalism can actually survive this unbundling, or do you think socialism might be inevitable?
So the question was, we're seeing a lot of decentralization. I guess I disagree with the premise. I think at the moment we're actually in a large centralization phase. We're in the phase where Google, Facebook, very highly centralized systems are dominant and dominate a lot of our attention.
Certainly disruption and people feeling, the ground kind of going beneath them in some of these industries.
Yeah, so we're very bullish. I'm very bullish on blockchain. We've got 4 blockchain-related investments, but I think that is all in its infancy today, and I don't think plays any meaningful role. I think it has the potential to play a meaningful role, but it's not playing a meaningful role today. And then the question about capitalism versus socialism. I mean, I had the pleasure to help ring the bell on the New York Stock Exchange today, so I'm definitely a believer that capitalism has an important role to play. So I think that there are, however, limits to capitalism. And the limits to capitalism arise in areas where you can't have prices. So why can't you have prices everywhere? Well, digital goods that have zero marginal cost, if you put a price on them, a fixed price, you're pricing some people out of it. But since it has zero marginal cost, you shouldn't price anybody out of it. So that's a problem for capitalism. Another problem for capitalism is very long tail events, like asteroid strikes. They're so rare, there's no price for them. And so as a result, we're under-allocating attention to them. I'm going to need a glass of water. 1 second.
Oh, yes. So while you get your glass of water, I think it's interesting to draw some analogies to, say, Occupy Wall Street and this term compassionate capitalism, which has become very popular. To some people, feels like an argument for the status quo. And that's what's interesting is the surprise effect. You mentioned Donald Trump. That was shocking to people, the success, but it says something about the fear and the paralysis that a lot of people are feeling and the sense that they can't control their future. So, you know, to get to being pro-capitalist and to get us over this hump to succeed in that knowledge economy, I think is very interesting.
Yeah, so
maybe investment in education or...
I guess to try to finish my answer, I don't believe socialism is the answer. I think most socialist experiments have failed. And by the way, people say, well, you proposing basic income, isn't that socialism? It's not at all. It's trying to actually let the labor market work better. At the moment, you have a lot of people who are in very precarious positions, and they are participants in the labor market without choice. And so they can't walk away from a bad job. They can't walk away from a bad city. Basic income solves those problems much more elegantly than, say, having to put a minimum wage in. The reason we feel we need a minimum wage is because we sense that people are being exploited. But the reason people are being exploited is because they don't have a walk-away option. So it's better to give people a walk-away option that's actually a more market-friendly solution than putting in a minimum wage. Now, I have no, I don't think we're going to get a basic income overnight. It's going to take a long time. The Swiss just voted on it. They voted against it by a very wide margin. But there's lots of sort of experimentation happening on the margins, and that makes me optimistic that this idea is one that's here to stay for some time.
And there are some interesting case studies that show the success of this. Does anybody have other questions? Yes, many others. So I'm going to go right here, and then to you, and then over there.
So the idea of a basic income to me is very interesting, and I think the strongest argument opposing it has been how do we pay for it? I've seen estimates in the trillions of dollars in the US. How do you think about that?
Yeah, so a lot of the estimates are wrong because people are looking at the gross amount. They're just taking the number of people who live in the US, multiply by, you know, whatever, $1,000 a month, and they come up with $3-4 trillion, and they go, well, that doesn't work. Obviously, you couldn't do this without also reforming the tax system. And once you think about how the two go hand in hand, it gets a lot easier. So there's a lot of deductions going around. Generally, people have more money, have more access to deductions and ways of avoiding taxes. So if you do away with many of those, even if everybody gets the basic income, you'll basically sort of, for many people, it'll be a total wash, or maybe actually they'll pay slightly more in
taxes. Like a
taxes.
tax credit almost.
Now, on the lower end, you may recall Mitt Romney's remark about the 47% that don't pay federal income taxes. Well, if you had a basic income and some sensible tax reform, you would start taxing first dollar of income in. And so everybody who had basic income would start paying federal taxes on the first dollar that they earn. And they would still be net better off, significantly better off than they are today. Now, I want to relate this to some of the discussion that was taking place earlier. I do think one of the on-ramps to basic income is portable benefits. We definitely need portable benefits. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And the people who are working on this are to be highly commended. So, so portable benefits is kind of an on-ramp. And then once you do the math on a net basis, in conjunction with some sensible tax reform, it actually winds up showing that basic income can be achieved at something like 10 to 12% of GDP, which seems like a very feasible number, even for a place like the United States that has a very low government quota.
Do we, and we have a question here, do we create work? I mean, we talk about creating income. Is there a role for government to create meaningful work? There's been attempts in the past to do that. I mean, we know that unemployment correlates with suicide rates and depression. I mean, what's the role of the government in that?
Yeah, so again, it's, I think, very tricky to unpack all of those things. So I'm a big believer that we need to invest more in infrastructure. It's hard not to be a believer in that if you live in New York City and drive on our roads or go to our airport. So, but in the past, that used to create new jobs. Today, you can build an entire subway line with a handful of people. I'm exaggerating slightly, but I actually looked at the numbers of, the Brooklyn Bridge construction employed a lot of people. The Second Avenue line does not employ a lot of people. So I think we have to separate. I think government has a role in infrastructure projects. I think government having a role in saying people should work on a specific thing. Government has historically not been a good allocator of people's labor and time, and so I think I'm a much bigger believer in creating freedom for individuals to find what they want to work on. This question of, suicide rate. The suicide rate is at the highest it's been in a long time. It's been on the rise for a number of years in the U.S. And people talk about being unemployed as a reason for this. And as I said earlier, I think in a society where we've constructed everything around work, where we've constructed schooling, identity, everything around work, if you're out of work, we're effectively telling people that you're not worthy, and that's a very bad thing. So the world that we're entering, we have to figure out how to find purpose elsewhere, and we have to figure out how to educate people so that they know that they can find purpose outside of work.
And I know we'll have to continue a lot of this conversation over drinks, but can we take a question right here?
So my question is a natural segue. So what would the post-industrial education system look like, not just K through 12, but maybe even K through undergraduate school? Sorry.
Yeah, so what would the education system look like? We've been fortunate to invest in some companies that we think are on the leading edge of this, companies like Duolingo and Codecademy and Skillshare and Edmodo. A lot of it is around sharing content very broadly, freely, a lot of freely accessible content, a lot of ability to learn whenever, wherever you want, to learn from whoever you want to learn. So, in other words, a lot less structure than we have today. Also, I would say a lot less formal credentialing. I think one of the wonderful things we're seeing is in many fields it's becoming possible to show your work. We're currently hiring for a new analyst. We do an open hiring process for analysts. We ask them to submit a video interview, very short, 2 questions, and we ask them to submit their online presence. And we're looking for people who are naturally intellectually curious. We're looking for people who can put together coherent thoughts. And it turns out that that process does a good job at finding such people. And among our last analysts, we hired somebody who's turned out to be amazing, who has very little of the sort of formal credentials that you might traditionally expect, but who did an amazing job answering questions. And again, we're overwhelmed with extraordinarily good candidates this time around. So, and we don't go and look which school did they go to or what degree did they get. We really spent basically 0 time on it. So I think much less structure. Let me tie that to something else that I think is very, very important. I talked about how digital technologies unbundle things. The other thing that digital technologies help us recognize, hopefully, is that we have all sorts of artificial categories in the world. In a world where information was very expensive, you had to put things into categories. You had to say somebody's an employee or a contractor, somebody's a professional or an amateur, somebody's is a publicly traded company or a private company. And we made all these distinctions because we had very limited bandwidth for information. And so we said, okay, you're a not-for-profit company, you're a for-profit company. You have totally different regulatory regimes. Now that we have virtually free information, we can do away with most of these categories. Like, it doesn't really matter whether you're for-profit, not-for-profit. If you disclose a lot of information, I can decide whether I want to support you. If you have a lot of information about where you work and when you work and so forth, why should I try and make a distinction between an employee and contractor?
Does it become more of a winner-take-all society where why would I listen to some guy in Podunk tell me about chemistry when I can hear a Nobel laureate, just turn on my computer?
That's a fantastic question, and one of the things that's happening as we're digitizing things is we're turning lots of things that used to be normal distributions into power laws. So the example I always give is if you were a shoemaker in early America, you know, your output, even if you were really industrious, was maybe 2x as high as the average shoemaker if you were a really industrious shoemaker. So these were normal distributions. But if you go on YouTube, the most viewed video has 1 billion times the number of views of the least viewed video, right? So, and that's going to be true for things like education. So we're taking a lot of things that used to be normal distributions where people could sort of earn a normal distribution of incomes, we're turning them into power laws. That's another reason why we need to start decoupling work from income from work.
I don't know if we have more time, but I want to get your thoughts, your advice for us as we leave here, and just, I know we'll get some closing thoughts for the conference, but what do you want people to take away? Give us some sense of, you actually are an optimist, I think, to some extent in terms of what your vision of the future is like. Can you give us some sense of what we can be doing personally, or even just to be thinking about more broadly and how we get there?
I'm very much an optimist as to where we can get to eventually. I am somewhat
What is
pessimistic.
eventually? Give us some time span.
Oh, I don't know. I think
12 to 18 months, 12 to 18 years? No.
Definitely not 12 to 18 months. Time spans are dangerous. As humans, we have this mistake where we overestimate how quickly something is going to happen, and then we underestimate how profound it's going to be when it gets here. So I'm very bad at these predictions, and most of my investing mistakes relate to being overly optimistic as to how quickly something is going to happen. So I am pessimistic as to how we're going to get there, and the reason I'm pessimistic is because too many people think it's a problem of sort of tweaking, dialing a few knobs, getting the interest rate right, and not enough people think, no, this is a much more foundational problem. And so I think if there's one takeaway, first of all, go read World After Capital. And leave your comments because it's in draft form, and I'm applying this concept of the knowledge loop, so I'm getting feedback and I'm going to incorporate that into the next version. But most importantly, take away this idea that we are in the middle of a very, very profound transition that is as profound as when we went from being foragers to the agrarian age, and when we went from the agrarian age to the industrial age.
Please join me in thanking Albert, and we can continue the conversation outside. So, Emil.
That was really amazing, you guys. Thank you. People who made today possible: steel case, they make the best stuff to sit on and stand at, pivot desk, flexible office spaces, my little job. Austin, New York. You should go find Austin. He made these amazing images over here. The Notel, company-sized workspaces. Hopefully you'll send some people our way. Felix, I think you should thank our team and everybody who made this thing happen.
Yes, there were a lot more people involved than ones to see on stage, so big applause for the volunteers, for the social media team from CUNY, for the New School, our educational partner, and for the many, many people from Notel. Thank you very, very much. And thank you all for being here. This was an awesome day.
Exactly, and stay tuned on our website because we're going to do something like this at some point in the future again.
For now, come and join us for a beer.
Beer.
Exactly. Beer.